Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently. In Genesis 2, verse 8, we see that Elohim put Adam and Eve in a garden, and I want to briefly talk about that. It says here, Yovah Elohim planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So Eden is a Hebrew word that means pleasure. And, it used to be that gardening was the number one hobby in the United States. This was many years ago. I don't know if that's true today. Maybe watching TV or watching movies or playing video games, at least among the younger generation, is the number one hobby today. I don't know. But most people had yards, and they had larger yards, and they liked getting out there, planting flowers, mowing the grass. And now, at least in the area where I live, very few people garden. Most people have somebody else do it for them, and many houses are being built. In my area, I live in a growing metropolitan area where where people have very small yards, very small side, front, and backyards, and these big houses on little tiny lots. But traditionally, human beings liked to garden, and still many people like to plant flowers in their front yard and beautify their yards. And that's because I believe our DNA, if you will, is wired to love gardening. Because when we get out there, we find it restful, peaceful. We plant things, we see things grow, we're creating beauty, and I think it goes back to the Garden of Eden. Gardening is about my favorite hobby. I especially like Japanese style gardening, and I'm a horticulturalist. I don't make my living from a ministry. I own and operate a tree care company. I've been doing this and pruning and taking care of trees and shrubs since I was a child. I grew up in the business. My father before me was a landscaper and a nurseryman, and I grew up on a farm where we took care of trees and orchards, and that my grandparents had planted and had vegetable gardens, and my dad had a nursery. So I've been a horticulturalist, a man of the earth. I have calluses on my hands. If you look at them, I'm out there digging and pruning and planting and climbing trees, and I've been doing that now professionally for over 30 years, and I've been doing that all my life, really. I started my business really 40 some years ago when I was not even before I was a teenager. I started pruning trees for money, and when I was about 12 years old, and almost 60 now. So anyway, I still love it. I love doing it. It's so peaceful. It is so relaxing. I love being in Yehovah's creation, and that's something that I have never gotten away from after all these years to this very day. I'm out working in my yard all the time, pruning and planting and transplanting and landscaping, and I just have a small yard, but it's like a Japanese garden, and I find great joy and peace in it. And I love to be in the mountains. I love looking at the flowers and the trees, hiking, backpacking, skiing, river rafting, all those things where I'm interacting with Yehovah's creation. I love to just sit and look at sunsets and the flowers and the birds. I love birds. I love trees. I love wild edibles. I love plants. I learned the names of these things, and I've learned how to interact with them and how to camp and backpack in the wilds. And so, I'm kind of a mountain man. In many respects. I spent a lot of time in the mountains, climbing mountains and skiing off of them and on them and so forth and so on. Anyway, all that to say is he planted us in a garden, and it means pleasure. That's what the word garden means. Eden. It's Gan Eden is the Hebrew for pleasure. Now I find this very interesting because Yehovah planted, if you will, Adam and Eve in a garden, and the story of the Bible begins in a garden, and it will end in a garden. It started with two people that Yehovah said to be fruitful and to multiply, and he gave them dominion over the garden, and he said, take care of the garden, till it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. He says, work it, and he commanded to work, and then the rest on the seventh day. We read in Exodus 20, I think starting in verse 8, work 7 days is a command, and on the seventh day you rest. Well, so Adam and Eve were put in a garden. They were created in this beautiful paradise, Gan Eden. And if you go to all the way to the end of the Bible, to the book of Revelation 21 and 22, the last two chapters of the Bible, the story of man ends in a garden. It's called the New Jerusalem. It's a city garden. It ends in a garden. Starts in a garden with two people who had a perfect relationship with Elohim. They walked together in oneness until they sinned and they fell. We'll talk about that in the next chapter or section on this video. And then in between this garden and this garden, you have the story of the fall of man and the redemption of man. That's basically the gospel message. And then you have redeemed and glorified men who have accepted the Messiah, Yeshua, and come into agreement with him, had their sin dealt with, and are walking back in alignment with Yehovah's commandments in oneness, who he now grants eternal life to live forever in the New Jerusalem. And we see descriptions of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21 and 22. It's a paradise on earth. And you can go read that. We have a video done on our website by my colleague, Dr. Joseph Dombeck, on the New Jerusalem, and it's a very popular video, one of the top videos based on views on this website, and you can find that. And he's done it's a long teaching, but he does a marvelous job of describing what the New Jerusalem will be like. So it's a beautiful thing. But between these two was the fall of man, the introduction of sin on the earth. And that's when the thorns and the weeds, and we'll talk about that later in the next section, came on the earth, and men had to work by the sweat of his brow, and pain and suffering, and it just, went downhill from there. But before sin entered the earth, human beings were in a garden. And that's why I think, and they will end up in a garden, those that are righteous and love Yehovah and want to obey him, and those that have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb will end up in a garden. So there's something very healing and beautiful and wonderful about a garden. And some of my best prayer times and best times of communing with Yehovah, where I hear his voice, are literally out when I'm walking or working in my garden or out in nature. And I would encourage you to spend time out in nature, spend time in his creation, communing with him, even as our fathers, our first father and first mother did with Yeshua. Yeshua in his pre-incarnate state, the Word. Now did in the here in the book of Genesis chapter 2. Now in verse 25, 2 verse 5, we see Yehovah said here. In other words, talks about tilling the garden. The word tilling the garden. And the word till there is the word of abad or avad in Hebrew, and it means to serve or to work. And so it's just a generic word. It's a generic verb, means to serve or to work. But I find it interesting because the work of the priest, the Kohanim in the Bible, was called their avodah, their service, the work that they did in the tabernacle, in the temple. The tabernacle of Moses was called their work or their service. Avad is the generic word, means to serve or to work, but it can also refer to a slave or a bondservant. So, as with a lot of Hebrew words, it has a lot of different meanings. But avodah is taken to mean, which comes from the word avad, means service, and it's referring to the worship service of the Levites. I think that's Numbers 4, verse 19 is one example of that, if I have that reference correct. And so, in a sense, we can work in the garden. That was one of the first job assignments Yehovah gave to Adam and Eve. And when we work in the garden, in a sense, it can be part of we can use that as part of our worship time, communing with Elohim. I just wanted to give you that that thought. Now, in the garden was the tree of life. There were two trees planted. Verse 9, it says, he gave them a command, and Yehovah Elohim planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man in whom he had formed, and out of the ground of Yehovah Elohim made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So here we have the introduction of two paths and two choices. The proverbial highway to heaven and the highway to hell. Now, Adam and Eve were created as immortal beings. And it wasn't until they sinned that then they lost their immortality and the death sentence for sin came upon them and they began to die. They were dead spiritually because they were cut off from Elohim. We'll talk about that in the next section. But they began to die. But they had a choice to make. Everybody has a choice to make. Are you going to feed from the tree of life or from the tree of knowledge? The tree of life says, yeah, I'm going to do it your way. I'm going to follow your commandments. You know what is best. You're the author. You're the creator. You're the lawgiver. You're the one that made everything. You kind of know what is best for us and what is not. Therefore, I'm going to make you the Lord, the master of my life, and I'm going to do it your way. We can do it that way, where he's the king of our life, or we can do it our own way. And that's feeding from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next section. But before we do that, this command to not feed, let me see, let me look at this. That's in verse 15. Yes, he says, of every tree, and Yehovah Elohim commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So here everybody has a choice. Everybody's a free moral agent. Everybody has a choice to choose the path of life or the path of death, the highway to heaven, so to speak, or the highway to hell, the path that leads up or the path that leads down. And he gives everybody that choice. And it's up to each person in his own heart and mind to make that choice. Now, we know that Adam and Eve disobeyed, but we'll talk about that in the next section. But this was the one command, the one prohibition, the only prohibition that he gave them. Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This was their Torah. This was, the word Torah, as we've talked about before, it means instruction or teaching. This was their Torah. They didn't have all 613 Torah commandments. This is what the Jewish sages teach, that there are that many in the books of the Torah, the books of the law. They had one Torah command, basically. I mean, he said, be fruitful and multiply. Okay, that was another one. But there was only one that was a prohibition. Do not eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, when sin entered, men were given more instructions. Because they needed more instructions, because there were more issues that they had to deal with. But the point I want to make is, this was not complicated. And he gave them basically one command. We'll talk more about that in the next section. So we'll just leave that hanging there for now. In the meantime, as kind of an incentive for you to watch or to listen to the next section, part 3 of this teaching. And in verse 15, Elohim told Adam and Eve to tend or to dress and keep the garden. Again, the word tend is the word avad. We already talked about that. It means to work or to serve. Adam was a gardener. In no way, I've spent almost all of my life gardening as an occupation, or I specifically focus on trees and tree care. So you find me up in trees quite a bit. I have done everything from owning a logging company to fine Japanese bone-style pruning, and I have literally done everything in between with regard to trees and plants and shrubs, and have been doing that for many decades. So I'm a glorified gardener, and I think gardening is probably one of the highest professions and occupations that a person could do. It's certainly got to be one of the closest ones to the heart of Elohim, because this is what Elohim told Adam and Eve to do, to tend and to till and to dress or take care of the garden. I find it interesting that Yeshua, who is the second Adam, Paul talks about this in the book of Romans, that after Yeshua's and he's the second Adam, he came to undo the mess that the first Adam got us into. And it's interesting that after Yeshua's resurrection, and he reappeared to the two disciples, in Acts 20:15, I think this is one of the ladies, they mistook him. They saw him in the garden after his resurrection, and they didn't recognize it was him, and they mistook him for a gardener. The gardener. This is in John 20, verse 15. And so, here Yeshua is mistaken for a gardener, and he was resurrected in a garden, whichever garden that was, wherever it was the tomb was. I think it was up on the Mount of Olives, maybe just above the Garden of Gethsemane, but that's another subject, another discussion. Now, I also want to focus in closing part of this particular teaching. I want to talk about tending and keeping the garden. The Torah teaches sustainable living and stewardship of the earth. The word now, it's politically correct to talk about sustainability and about eco-friendly this and eco-friendly that, and being green, and green is the new political correct. Let me read to you what Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, how it defines sustainability. It defines sustainability as follows. Sustainability is the capacity to endure. For humans, sustainability is the long-term maintenance of responsibility, which has environmental, economic, and social dimensions and encompasses the concept of stewardship, the responsible management of the resource use. In ecology, sustainability describes how biological systems remain diverse and productive over time, a necessary precondition for the well-being of humans and other organisms. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon writes the famous saying that there's nothing new under the sun. And I want to tell you, caring for the earth, sustainable living, being ecologically friendly, environmentally friendly is not a new concept. It goes back to the Torah. So when Yehovah Elohim instructed Adam and Eve to tend and to take care of the garden, this is one of his first commands. Be fruitful, multiply, and tend and take care of the garden, and then don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These were his first several commands that he gave them. This was their Torah. At this point, they didn't need anything else. Yehovah was commanding the first humans to be good stewards of what Elohim had created, to preserve, maintain, and care for it. Now, Yehovah has never rescinded those instructions. Never once. He's never rescinded them. They are applicable today as they were back thousands of years ago, when Adam and Eve were created, roughly 6,000 years ago. So the concept that the modern environmentalists have and the conservationists have of responsible stewardship of the environment is not a new concept. Long before Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Henry David Thoreau, the Sierra Club, the Earth First, the Nature Conservancy, the Germany's Green Party, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and many of our states have their own EPAs. In Oregon, we call it the Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ. Long before we had all of these movements, these agencies, these these groups, these philosophers that talk about nature, naturalists, and preserving nature. The Torah gives us teachings on sustainable living and responsibly caring for the environment. Let me give you some examples of this. For example, in Leviticus 19, 23, and 25, we see that for the overall health and vigor of fruit trees, Israelites were allowed, the fruit trees were to be allowed to become established for 3 years before commercially harvesting the fruit. Those of us that care for fruit trees and prune fruit trees, we know that this is for the benefit of the fruit tree, so that it can be established to be strong and healthy. And I'm not going to get into that, but as a certified arborist, I understand the principles behind that. They're going clear back, and why it's good for the fruit tree to not harvest the fruit and not encourage it. That way it can put its energy into building a strong root system and a strong trunk and branching structure. And then when the fruit falls, it can help to fertilize the tree as well. Leviticus 25 verse 2. So as not to deplete the soil's fertility, agricultural land was to lay fallow every 7th year. To lay fallow, and so that the earth could replenish itself from depletion. Fruit trees were to be preserved in times of war. Deuteronomy 20:19. So as not to mongolize similar types of fruits and vegetables through cross-pollination. Mixed seeds were not to be sown together. Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22 verse 9. Interbreeding of diverse kinds of livestock was prohibited. Leviticus 19:19. Now, we could talk about each one of these as a horticulturalist and growing up on a farm and understanding a little bit about animal husbandry. These things make sense to me. But hopefully you can we're just kind of tagging these bases in hopes that you will see that the Bible does teach preservation and care of the earth. Work animals were allowed to eat the grain that they helped to thresh. Genesis 25 verse 4. Do not muzzle the ox that tread the corn. So the Bible's very, not only talks about caring for fruit trees, but and other agricultural crops, but also your animals. Animal husbandry. If a farm animal was injured or in danger, one was obliged to help the animal even if it belonged to someone else. Deuteronomy 22 verse 4. For the safety and well-being of work animals, an ox and a donkey were not to be yoked together when plowing. Deuteronomy 22:10. Again, there's reasons for that, which we're not going to get into right now. Work animals were to be allowed to rest on the Sabbath. Exodus 20 verses 8 through 11 and Deuteronomy 5 verse 14. Humans are we're to rescue animals that are hurt or lost or have fallen into a pit, even on the Sabbath. Yeshua said this in Matthew 12:11 and 12. And then we read about this in Exodus 23 verse 4. The bird's nest, and a lot of people don't know this is in the Torah. It's one of those little known laws, but it's in there. Bird's nests and young hatchlings were to be cared for. Deuteronomy 22, 6 through 7. Humans were to care for the earth and to prevent diseases by burying their excrement. Leviticus 14, verses 43 through 23:13. And the establishment of toxic waste dumps for diseased and contaminated materials were to be established in Leviticus 14, 43 through 47. So hopefully you will have a little bit more of an appreciation for the Torah in that it teaches us to be environmentally responsible and take care of the earth, take care of the garden in which we have been placed, where Yehovah told us to take care, preserve, till, and work the garden. And finally, in chapter 2, verse 16, it says here, Yehovah commanded, we've already read this, and Yehovah commanded the man saying, of every tree of the garden you may eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, and the day that you eat thereof you shall die. And this is a good segue into the next section that we will cover. But this, as I said before, this was the one commandment the one prohibition that Yehovah gave them. They had a choice. Adam and Eve had a choice. Are they going to obey Yehovah's commandment and not eat from this tree or not? And of course we know this was their Torah. This was their instruction in righteousness. Do not touch this tree. Do not eat of it. And we know that they did. And, well, as I say, the rest is history.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon his name. He is near, he is near, he is near. Yeshu Hashem Behir Matzov Kerahu Yoto Karov Yasov Rashad Darko Yishavim Machshevotav Yashovel Ad Hashem Ki Arbe Lis Yeshu Hashem Behim Matzov Kerahu Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon his name. He is near, he is near. Yeshua Hashem Behim Matzor Kerahu